Welcome to Therapy Facts with Dr. Jenn. Today we are talking about therapy facts from the Diddy Cassie video. Now, let me say to you that I did not watch the video because I am in the habit of guarding my heart as a way to protect my mental health. So I did not watch the video. However, the topic of the video is a tale as old as time: domestic violence. So, domestic violence is a complicated phenomenon. And I am going to be talking about domestic violence between relationship partners. So, people who are in committed relationships, dating relationships, marriage, or whatever other relationship that typically is going to involve some sexual interaction, consensual sexual interaction and behavior. So that's what I'm talking about. But domestic violence occurs between multiple types of dyads and groups, not just relationship partners. However, that's our topic for today. So, what is domestic violence? So often people look at people in circumstances and say to themselves, I would never, or I wish I would, right? Without realizing that not only have they ever, but they have has already would. All right. Domestic violence happens in a space where someone is trying to, typically a male adult, is trying to control the behavior of a female adult. And of course, we know that a male adult can be in relationships with men, women, and both. But for the sake of convention, we're going to say a male person and a female person. We also know that female persons commit domestic violence as well. But what we do also know is that male persons are typically the ones identified as perpetrators, and women are typically identified as victims. However, we know that both men and women in both heterosexual relationships and other types of relationships commit domestic violence against other people, and can also be, men and women can also be victims of domestic violence. Okay. So let me say that. So domestic violence involves another adult who is trying to control another adult. So an adult who is trying to control another adult. And the control comes in various ways. It can be more subtle and show up as attempts to isolate the other person from family and friends, belittling the person, making the person second guess themselves, and undermining their self-esteem and or confidence. It can include limiting access to resources and assets such as money, cars, even medicine, all the way up to physical intimidation and physical and sexual assault. So any intentional attempt by one adult to control the behavior, the thoughts, and the emotions of another adult can be considered domestic violence. And again, we're talking about adults who are in relationships, and legally, domestic violence is considered people who cohabitate. But we also know that domestic violence can happen with couples or with partners who don't live together. Okay. And so you have those various types of behaviors that can be engaged. And so a lot of times, if people are only looking for physical and or sexual assault, they can miss that they themselves have been victims of domestic violence or even perpetrators of domestic violence. The second question is, well, who is affected? As I said before, domestic violence can happen at the hands of a man or a woman. Victims can be men or women. Research shows also that young dating couples, young people in their teens and early 20s, are often in domestic violence relationships. Domestic violence can also be mutual. So you could have two people in a relationship both trying to control each other through the same or similar tactics. So it doesn't have to go just one way or the other. However, the hallmark of victimization is when someone is truly afraid for their lives or afraid for their safety and believe that they don't have any other choice, or they don't have a lot of choices other than to be with the person who harms them. And so that is a hallmark of victimization. So it happens among, again, both males and females. It happens among every culture. It happens among every income status. It happens among every education status. And research shows that actually the most vulnerable condition for domestic violence is actually pregnancy. Believe that, right? So domestic violence is a lot more common than we realize because it can be perpetrated through a lot more strategies and is a lot more widespread than we realize. So when people started talking about the Diddy video, I was astounded on the one hand, but just shook my head out of recognition on the other hand to say, poor thing, both of them, let's say, give them both recognition that both of them were in great company. He, as the perpetrator, is in great company. There's a ton of perpetrators out here. And she, as the clear victim in that video, she's among a ton of victims. And so there is no limitation on who can be a victim or a perpetrator of domestic violence. The number one question is probably, why do people stay? And the answer to that question is a bit tricky, but is related to starting with the subtleties of domestic violence tactics, right? And so typically, someone who wants to control another adult decides to engage in the more subtle tactics first, typically, to see what the person's response will be. And they typically wrap those tactics up in lots of sugar, lots of chocolate, lots of sweet stuff, sweet, sticky, syrupy stuff to help the victim to digest the behavior that they are delivering to them. And if the victim doesn't see what is happening, then the perpetrator will slowly ramp up their tactics until the victim is in a position where she feels that she is in an unfortunate individual circumstance with someone who really loves her and someone she really loves. And so she is groomed and or seduced into accepting a certain amount of control, a certain amount of manipulation, so that when someone ramps up to engage in a behavior that is widely seen as domestic violence, very often the victim will talk herself out of being outraged or leaving with the notion that, hey, I have dealt with something similar to this because he loves me. And so this is only maybe a little worse, or if it is a lot worse, I'm going to choose to believe if he tells me he is sorry, Or if he tells me that it's my fault that he did such a behavior, I'm going to choose to believe that. And then I'm going to do everything I can do to make sure he doesn't do that to me again. And so the moment she makes excuses, accepts apologies, and silences the inner voice that wants to be safe, that wants to survive. The first, the second, the third, the fourth, the 20th, the 30th time she does that, now she's stuck because this person's behavior is only going to get worse. And when we talk about leaving, research also shows that a woman who is in a domestic violence situation is at most risk for death when she is in the act of leaving. I'll say it again. A woman who is in a domestic violence situation is at most risk for death, not just harm, but death when she is leaving. Okay? And so the time to get out is when one notices those first little subtle attempts. But if the love is amazing and intoxicating, or if the confidence is low and the resources are limited, a person is well more likely to put up with those subtleties in the hopes that the person will change. And in fact, the person might even agree and pledge to change. And so by the time she realizes that the change is not coming in the right direction, then she's stuck. However, there are plenty of people who come out of domestic violence situations, and there are plenty of resources for coming out of domestic violence situations. But just understand that domestic violence as a phenomenon is fairly complex and is not as easy to remove oneself once the hole has gotten big as people might think.